The Stair by K.B. Hurst. I used to sublet from my best friend, who was a model, so while she was away on location for work, I stayed and rented out her beautiful apartment overlooking the beaches of Miami. It was a beautiful spot, and she only charged me for electricity, water, and gas. My apartment had a balcony overlooking the ocean. Off to the left, where all of the adjoining flats stood, were other balconies like mine. I never gave it much thought, as every morning I took my coffee on the balcony as I watched the waves hitting the shoreline. I soaked in the early sunrise and the salty sea air. I worked from home, and so it was my little reprieve away from my tiny bedroom with the makeshift office I created for myself in a very large walk-in closet. It was one of those mornings that I first noticed it. The shadow of a tall man was staring at me. He seemed to appear from one of the balconies directly across from mine. It was a recently unoccupied residence of an older woman that had died of a heart attack. I only noticed him because he was dressed in a long black rain jacket. It was an odd thing to be wearing in the morning, as the weather was often in the 90s, even at that early part of the morning. I had never seen him before in my life. I assumed he was new to the building complex. I often took notice of my neighbors, like Mr. Hansen, who was older, and we would often exchange hellos while he watered his beautiful tomatoes that hung from the balcony. There was Brianna, a younger girl, that regularly smoked in the morning, and I sometimes noticed she had rings around her eyes from late nights spent clubbing. She never said much to me, but now and then she would lean on the balcony and wave. Most of the tenants in the complex were well known to each other, and most of them were older. They were friendly too, and there was an unknown rule to all look out for one another. So when I noticed the man staring at me, I made a mental note that I'd ask around that day when I took Bernice, my friend's Bichon, for a walk. I looked away from his gaze and pretended I didn't notice him. It was then that he stepped out from the shadows and came closer to the balcony edge. He just stood there, not making one single move. He only looked at me. I was able to make out that he had dark brown hair and ashen skin. The other thing I noticed was he made absolutely no expression on his face, except for a slight curious tilt at the corners of his mouth. He unnerved me, and I decided to go indoors to the safety of my apartment. I poured myself another cup of coffee, and as I looked out the doors from my kitchen, the man was still staring at my residence. I closed the blinds and went into my office to begin my work. I tried to forget the man who had stared at me that morning, but then my stomach began to grumble around 11 a.m. I closed my laptop and went into my kitchen to prepare a meal of tuna salad and some lemonade. I looked outside towards the balcony, and I did not see the man. He had to be gone by now. I looked out and saw Mr. Hansen sitting on his patio, enjoying a cup of iced tea with his giant thick black sunglasses on. I opened my glass doors to the balcony. "Hello there, Mr. Hansen. It's a fine breeze we have today."
"Oh, hello, Gemma. Yes, it is. How's your work going?"
"Oh, it's pretty boring, but it keeps me busy."
"Ah, my tomatoes will be ready early this year, and they're already getting red."
"Excellent," I had called out to him. Then I saw the man had mysteriously appeared again. This time, he was standing directly behind Mr. Hansen. He was still staring at me, and I stopped talking to Mr. Hansen, thinking perhaps he may introduce me as his friend. Instead, The tall man leaned into Mr. Hansen's face and then whispered into his ear. Mr. Hansen put his head down after that and then looked up at me. I'm feeling rather tired. I think I'll go inside and take a nap. I nodded, and he and the man went inside. I wondered who the man was, and I could have sworn that I had seen him in an adjacent apartment from Mr. Hansen's earlier that morning. I thought nothing of it until I did not see Mr. Hansen for a few days. I was walking Bernice when I saw our building manager, Troy. Hey, I haven't seen Mr. Hansen from apartment 2A in a while. How is he? Oh, I can't say that I know. I mean, I imagine he's doing okay. It's supposed to rain, so I know he'll be excited about the rain for his tomato garden. He smiled. I nodded, but still had this strange feeling that something was wrong. A week finally went by, and I still didn't see Mr. Hansen. I also noticed that his tomatoes were beginning to die and wilt from lack of watering. I spent that afternoon trying to get a hold of our building manager to do a wellness check on Mr. Hansen. I got absolutely no work done, as I was growing very anxious. Finally, I could take it no more, and I decided to walk down to the bridge that connected the two buildings to the apartment complex. I crossed the bridge, and when I got to the floor Mr. Hansen was on, I noticed something odd. There was a strange floral smell coming from it. I thought it smelled like a rose bush. I took a deep breath, as it was quite overwhelming to me, and then I made my way to Mr. Hansen's apartment. When I approached the door, I could hear old jazz music playing from inside. I knocked on the door. Mr. Hansen? It's Gemma from across the balcony. I've come to see if you're all right. The music stopped. I was relieved when I heard footsteps coming towards the door. I could see shadows of someone's feet under the door, but the person just stood on the other side, almost as if they were listening to me breathing. I was afraid to knock again. Instead, I backed away from the door. I called out to Mr. Hansen one last time. Mr. Hansen, please open the door. I'm worried about you. I saw the shadows of feet moving again, and then I heard the old-time jazz music go back on. I was about to call the police when someone opened the door to the apartment directly next to Mr. Hansen. It's been going on all night. I recognized it was Brianna. She was tired-looking as usual, and her long black hair hung over her tattoos on her shoulder. She wore a black crop top, and there was a noticeable bruise on her hip. What has been going on all night? I asked her. That shitty old people music. Oh. Hey, do you know who the man was with Mr. Hansen last week? Tall, pale, dark hair, wearing a black raincoat like it was October? Brianna laughed at me. No, but he sounds just like my type. Never mind. Thanks anyway, I said and walked down the hallway. Hey! Brianna called out to me. Yeah? If I see him, I'll tell him you were worried. In the meantime, there's a band playing at the old Grotto studio tonight if you're interested. Oh, no thanks though, I have some work to catch up on. Right on, Brianna said, lighting a cigarette as she returned to her apartment, slamming the door. I went back to my apartment and figured that Mr. Hansen just wanted his privacy. There was the matter of his tomatoes. I would call Troy again in the morning to check on Mr. Hansen. The next morning, I woke to strange lights from outside. It was nearly 6 a.m., and there were red and blue flashing lights. I opened the door to my bedroom and walked into the kitchen, facing the balcony doors. I saw blood on the patio down below, and what looked like a body. Directly across from me were what looked like detectives casing the place. One of them took a photo of me standing in my robe, and then I heard a knock at the door a few moments later. It was my building manager, Troy. "Hey, there's been a horrible accident. I got your message, but it was too late. Mr. Hansen jumped 3 stories down to the patio below and killed himself." I looked at Troy in shock. Behind Troy was another man, who I later learned was a detective, to ask me if I had seen anything strange. I had not. But I did mention he was with the man in the black raincoat a few days prior, and that was the last time I had seen or heard about Mr. Hansen. I was saddened, but life goes on, as they say. Things went back to normal as best they could. And then I saw him. I felt his eyes on me before I looked up. My neighbor Brianna was having a party. It was loud, but given she didn't have a next-door neighbor since Mr. Hansen died, it wasn't shocking she would be taking advantage of that for now. I looked across the balcony to see the tall man. He was staring at me again. Where did he come from? Who was he? He approached the edge of the balcony with that strange, still gaze. His lips turned slightly up at the corners of his mouth. This time I could not take my eyes from his. Then he did something rather odd. He leaned over the balcony, tilted his head downwards, towards the concrete, as if referring to what happened to Mr. Hansen. I followed his gaze, and when I looked up, he was gone. The next morning I woke up and went to sit on the balcony to have my morning coffee. I wondered if I would see the staring man again, but instead, I saw something somewhat concerning. Brianna sat in her lounge chair. Her shirt was open to reveal her bikini, and her eyes were wide open towards the sunrise. Her arm showed what looked to be like a needle still in her vein. Appearing directly behind her was the staring man. He looked straight towards me, and then his gaze went from me to something behind me. In my kitchen was another man exactly like the man across the balcony from me. He was coming closer to me, and as I looked downward, I realized that I was about to jump. I heard Bernice, the dog, as she ran towards the man in the kitchen. It seemed to catch whatever he was off guard, and instead of him coming closer, he stopped in his tracks, looked down at the dog, tilting his pale face to one side as though he were curious and had never seen a dog before. And I screamed at him, "Get the hell out of my house!" He only looked at the dog, but backed out of my apartment and slowly shut the door. The man from across the balcony had disappeared as well. I still don't know who or what those men were. Miraculously, Brianna was not dead, though. She had suffered an overdose, but it wasn't lethal. When my roommate came back, she told me I had to move out because she was going to be relocating overseas. I wasn't upset about it because I had planned on leaving anyway. I still have nightmares about the man and his staring. I often wonder if he were a harbinger of death. I guess I'll never know. I just hope I never see him again.